All right, welcome back to Disruptive RX. I'm your host, Dr. Inderpal Randhawa. I am very excited about today's episode. We're going to kind of dive right into what disruptive thinking looks like. Remember, this can be in any sector, any line of business. What does that look like? What does that story look like when you're trying to get into a system and really try to invoke some serious change? And I'm going to really try to focus on what I'd say is probably my biggest area of impact where I use this philosophy, and that's in the space of food allergies. And it's been a long couple decades of that story. The impact's been really pretty awesome and pretty tremendous. But first off, I want to introduce Sean Andre, my partner in crime here. And good to see you again, Sean.
Likewise.
And I was going to kick it off by asking you, what was your story in kind of getting into this space of food allergies?
So I remember back in fourth grade very vividly, a good friend of mine was allergic to just about everything. He would bring just a bunch of pills to school. And, when you think about, third, fourth, fifth grade, kids can be mean sometimes, right?
Sure.
And so they gave him the hardest time and with all the different pills that he had to take. And so I went back to that when I saw this opportunity to work with you. And then I started watching some of your videos online, was simply blown away by what you've been able to accomplish. And I was easily able to separate what you do and your treatment process versus what everybody else does. So what everybody else does doesn't matter. What you do matters, and it's been life-changing. So it's an honor to work with you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I think it's just a reflection of kind of how quickly things can change.
Sure.
The space of food allergy has been around for 100 plus years. I mean, it was documented in the Civil War of all times. Actually, when it was first put out there,
Wow.
You had soldiers coming off the field and they were exposed to something, they ate something, and they were having this weird type of swelling and they didn't know what it was. That's what it was. Fast forward another, 4 or 5 decades, 1913, they gave the Nobel Prize to a couple doctors and said, hey, we're going to call this thing anaphylaxis. So imagine that, 1913.
Wow.
And then almost for the next 100 years, not a lot of movement. They had this stuff called adrenaline, which eventually became an EpiPen, so people know about that. But that's kind of just framing out this space, this
Right.
area of life science.
Sure.
That affects 35 to 40 million people in the U.S. alone, probably another 100 million people globally. And they got to live every day walking on eggshells and saying, oh man, I hope today's not the day that I get a reaction.
Right.
And what's crazy about it is, I mean, I don't know if you even know, do you know how many people every single month end up in the hospital or potentially can die from these things? It's crazy, right? It's a minimum of around 40 to 50 fatal cases a month.
A month.
And you're looking at probably thousands. We can't even quantify how many people end up in the ER or the ICU. So it is that serious an issue, right?
Yeah.
I mean, think about, all of what we just talked about and then say, well, then what does like the general public think about this?
Right.
And how often are they making jokes about it? There was just this thing on Uber, an Uber commercial during the Super Bowl.
I remember that.
Right.
Yep.
And so basically it was about, hey, if you forget stuff, maybe you're actually kind of doing something better for yourself.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it was the whole one with Jennifer Aniston and Friends and saying,
Right.
hey, I forgot that I was on Friends, that whole play.
Yeah.
And they had a guy eating a jar of peanut butter and he had hives and swelling all over his face. And he was like, yeah, I'm not sure, this stuff is so good. I'm not sure what if I'm forgetting something. Imagine that, right? So okay, maybe humorous if you never have or had to deal with that stuff.
Right.
But to the 40 million people who kind of live like that, that was a big deal.
Well, and we've seen cases here recently where the famous chef, Michael Chiarello,
Yep.
passed away at the age of 60, I believe.
Yep.
Last year, you actually had a write-up in People magazine
That's right.
talking about that. And then also recently, the doctor at Disneyland, I believe.
That's right, yeah. A doctor out of NYU who, knew she had anaphylaxis, went to Disney World. Disney's, I'd say, one of the more safer places where people think things should be okay.
Sure.
She did everything right. She told everybody, hey, don't put this in my food, et cetera.
Right.
And still ended up having a major reaction, still even gave herself EpiPen shots and still died. And so, again, it's just kind of the way the system is, right? Why this disease of all diseases somehow got, I'd say, from a society standpoint, sidelined.
Right.
And then from a medical health life sciences standpoint, also got sidelined. And that's kind of where I started, 20 years ago,
Right.
looking at all this.
So let's go back to the beginning, Dr. Randhawa. So where did this hunger and thirst for knowledge originate? Can we go back to the very beginning? We're going to take you all the way back.
Let's go way back. Not quite diapers, I guess, but
A little bit after that.
yeah, no, I mean, I've always been, I guess, a little more eccentric in that sense. I mean, I remember even my kindergarten teacher would say, I do. I mean, I wasn't like a advanced student per se or anything of that nature, but I'd always kind of wrap everything up very quickly. She'd say hey, here's this work, and I'd actually kind of sit down and just want to work through it, figure it out, and everybody else would be playing outside at recess. And so that's how I was back then. And I'd say, that curiosity was always there. I always talk about my dad, being a veterinarian who was a research scientist. So I was exposed to a lot of these questions. I think he did a really good job about asking me questions, and making me think about things differently. I think the curiosity was always there. I remember, always looking at these animal cases that would come into the animal hospital and say, pretty cool how we're able to save so many of these animals. But then there's a lot of them that you couldn't save.
Right.
And I remember having those discussions about what's fair about this, kind of why is that? And my dad would always say, look, things have to get better. Things have to evolve. And that is the critical aspect of research. And I remember posing the question, I was like, well, how come it doesn't get better fast enough? And he said, that's on you.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
No pressure.
No pressure. No pressure. But ultimately, like I said, that's kind of where I grew up. And then I went into, high school, college, and so forth. I was always in the research space. I was working in research labs, even as a high school student, which is pretty unusual. Still did in college, did in med school, and always tied that together with what I saw in the hospital setting. And, I wrote a piece about this a number of years back and was interviewed about it as well, about the piece I wrote, and said, I would go in a hospital and I saw all this energy, all these people trying to do the right thing, nurses, physicians, administrators. But then ultimately, the outcomes weren't that great. They weren't getting better. And at some point, people would put in all this energy and then kind of just stall. And I was like, wow, that's not great. If you talk to the families, who are losing their loved ones, why is this the system that we have? So I always looked at things more from a forecasting standpoint. Why are we waiting until the very end to try to save somebody? And you're talking about a guy who's a transplant immunologist, right? Where we're the last people in line. And again, as much as I, still work in that space and enjoy that field, it's not the ideal way to do it.
Sure.
Right? And if you can modify things, I think it's that kind of approach that got me thinking about disruption.
Asking questions in our society today, even in 2024, it seems that, people are still a bit trepidatious about asking questions.
For sure.
And you're the complete opposite. That's partly why you're here today and so successful, because you've always asked questions along the way.
I think it's asking questions, but it's also just challenging the status quo or challenging systems.
Sure.
And not to do it in a way that's offensive, right? But ultimately, you have to look at a system and say, okay, well, this is where we are. Why is it that way? And when's the last time we've analyzed, is this the best way to do things? And, you can look at any area. I mean, you look at, FAA and flights and so forth, and the evolution of what it took to develop safety in that space.
Sure.
That's now like 50, 60 years old, right? And now we're having these near misses and issues again. And hey, why did you wait 50 years to reassess?
Right.
So ultimately, kind of just challenging and asking questions. You could look at public safety, and you could look at what's gone on, in the policing system. Same thing. Why are we having the same old system? Education, same problem, right? We have standards from 20 years ago that we're using, and now we have AI that's completely changed the way education works.
Right.
So huge problem. But that's what I'm saying. Having the lens on where you say, hey, is this the right thing that we're doing right now based on what old system, and can it be modified or can it be any better?
We talked about, I think I mentioned Dr. Stephen Hawking last episode, and we talked about how ALS, or we talked about it maybe before the episode, but they have not made a lot of advances with ALS. So I lost my grandmother to ALS. And so kind of like with the food allergy space, there's a timeline in the building at the hub, at the Food Allergy Institute. And it's quite amazing because what you see is that in recent history, not a lot has happened in that food allergy space. And so I think the EpiPen in 71, maybe?
1976.
In 76, okay.
Right. Yep.
And so not a lot of advancements up until you, Food Allergy Institute.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's quite amazing.
You had to want to dive into it. I mean,
Right.
that's as simple as it gets. But yeah, no, my initial, kind of work in this space, and I always tell people this, I myself don't have food allergies. My kids don't. I have nobody in and I'd say my family circle that has it. And yet, to be frank, never had a lot of interest in it. Early on, I was, again, an ICU guy, transplant guy. All my research was in the immune space and pulmonary space, whatnot. And all of a sudden, you see these kids come in the ICU, and that's a very different thing. It's not like you see them with a small rash.
Sure.
They're coming in extremely sick.
Mm.
And, first couple times you're like, okay, that's strange. And then, you start comparing them to the other cases that I'm dealing with. So I'm dealing with, liver transplants, lung transplants. These are people who are very sick too, right? Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But it's almost like we would prioritize those patients over these patients.
Mm.
Even though they're, equally sick, without a doubt, they're in the ICU.
Right.
These guys are just, they just have a food allergy. And so I kind of bought into that for a little bit. But then when I started seeing them come in extremely sick, and then I started seeing them brain injured, and then I started seeing them pass away from this, those are the cases that just kind of was like, this makes no sense. At least the patients who I have, the transplant option for, I'm buying time.
Sure.
Right. Maybe I can buy them 6 months. Maybe I can buy them 5 years or 10 years. Right. But I have a plan to kind of get them to that point. These kids come in and they're totally fine 20 minutes ago, and now we're in real serious trouble. And I still remember, the cases going back to like 2005, where they'd come in a series, and they almost came in like seasonally. They came in at the end of school when all of a sudden things were like just more relaxed. You make mistakes. They'd come in with the start of school. Again, they were kind of safe at home. Now they're back at school. Now there's problems again. And I was like, this can't keep happening, right? So, I mean, that's kind of where the whole thing started.
Were you amazed that some of your colleagues didn't ask questions about that? Because you have colleagues that hey, they could have maybe asked some questions back in the day, and maybe found a remedy for some of this, but they didn't. But you were one of the few that stood up and said, "Wait a minute, this is not right." Like you said, if you had a patient to come in, anaphylactic shock, and maybe they're not here or their life is on the line, versus a transplant patient where you could possibly buy them time, but nobody else was asking these questions as to why.
No, not at all. And remember, I work at like super academic places, right? These are academic hospitals where everyone there kind of supposed to think like that. And when I posed that question to them and said, "Hey, look, this doesn't make any sense. How are we going to get better at this?" They were like, "It's not my thing. I'm no interest in that." And then even further, I would actually start to show them their cases and say, "Hey, look at the diagnostic data around these patients. Like this one, numbers aren't very high. They're extremely sick. This one's numbers are very low, and they're also extremely sick." There was nothing that made sense about it. And when I brought it up, they're like, "Yeah, that's just not our space."
Just wrote it off. Like,
Wrote it off. Yeah.
wow.
And I think ultimately what kind of pushed me over the edge, I will never forget this. There was a mom, this Korean family, and they lived up in the hills up in LA and Pasadena area. And they had a young son. I think he was 8 or 9 years old, and anaphylactic to milk. And, mom knew this. Nothing was a surprise, and he got his brother's milk. He had regular milk, and he was not supposed to obviously eat that. He somehow poured that in his cereal. He probably only had like a teaspoon of milk, and so forth. And he told his mom, he's like, "Oh, I'm not feeling good. This is a big problem." And she had seen him have small amounts of milk before, and thought it was okay. I'll just put him in the car and go to the ER. Mm-hmm. Okay, so she puts him in the car. He's in the back seat, and she's holding on to the EpiPen, looking at him in the rearview mirror, hoping that okay, this will just be like the other times. By the time she got down the hill, and I don't know how long it took for her to get to the ER, but let's say it's 20 minutes. He was already like passed out on the seat, and then obviously everyone got involved. And by the time I actually got to talk to her, he is already passed away. Right, he was already essentially brain injured or brain dead. And I just still remember her holding on to the EpiPen. This is hours later, and she just did not let go of that thing. Wow. I didn't have the audacity to ask why she didn't use it. I'm not sure that would have changed the outcome. Maybe, maybe not. We certainly see cases where it does help. In some cases, despite the epi, it doesn't help at all. But those kind of images, like, they just are absolutely imprinted in your mind.
Sure.
And it was after that case that I said, you know what, I'm going to try to do something.
Try.
Yeah.
Why don't people try? I mean, that it's something simple to do. If you fail, so be it. But at least try.
But Sean, it's a long hill. It's a long hill, and it's straight up. I mean, imagine saying, like, I'm going to try to go after a condition. How? Where do you get your funding? Where are you going to find any collaboration?
Sure.
Who's going to support you? Is this just, a crazy idea, right?
Right.
But like I said, you see it enough times, and it just kind of it sticks with you.
Yeah. Since we're talking about origin, I'd like to go back to your father.
Yep.
And the type of role model he was. I mean, somebody I'm sure you emulated, and research scientists dealing with animals. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a key aspect of how I grew up, and it's a key kind of shadowing that I had, I think, because again, you think of, obviously a lot of people have pets. You go to a typical veterinarian and it's very mechanical. It's business-like, you're going to save these many animals. You can't save these many animals. And when I was growing up, there was no holds barred. We tried to save every single animal. Like, there was never a case where my dad would say, yeah, this one's too far gone.
Yeah.
And I thought that was normal, right? Because that's all I ever saw.
Sure.
And, sadly, we have to, there are animals that you have to euthanize, you have to put them down.
Yeah.
And I always found it super interesting when when that had to happen, the people who kept track of it would always come, not every month, they would come like once or twice a year and be like, your hospital really doesn't euthanize very many animals. And I was like, well, there's a story behind that, because this man, my father, Dr. Randhawa, he basically said, we're going to try to save every animal. And sometimes that meant, the bills were too high for the families, and he would say, all right, we're going to just write this off. Or if they said, you know what, I don't want any responsibility, he'd say, sign away your animal to me, and I will try and save the animal.
Wow.
And so for most of my childhood, I grew up with, dozens and dozens of animals, cats, dogs, you name it, out of this belief that we should try everything possible, with our hands to try and save life.
Wow. You know what? When I think about my father and I hear stories about your father, for me, I emulated one particular aspect of him, and that was his storytelling. He could just captivate an audience, and I wanted to be like him. And so that led me to broadcasting back in the day. But I was always just amazed at how he could captivate any audience. It didn't really matter who it was. And so is there like a particular aspect of your father that you wanted to emulate? Was it work ethic? Was it one thing that really, really stood out?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say the work ethic was certainly there. I never saw anybody work as hard as he did. I mean, it didn't matter. You're talking, 80, 100 hours a week. It was normal. I think ultimately, that was not good for his health. It took a toll. But, it was just who he was, right? But I think even more unique than that was this ability to say, let's take something very complex and try and piece it out. Let's try to actually understand this thing. And with that comes a lack of fear, right? Because, yes, he was a veterinarian, but he was also a research scientist. He worked on some of the first xenografts that were done. So these are like transplants from animals to humans, right? Which is very difficult work. And the willingness to even take that on, as an immigrant, coming into a new system in this country, takes a lot of guts. But then, he went and did environmental work. He wanted to look at quality, clean air. This is way back when that was not even popular.
Sure.
And he was just always willing to take a complex issue, go get books, and basically break it down and say, no, can I understand this? And can I find a way to wrap my head around it? And then can I make an impact?
Wow.
And I think that fundamentally describes, my approach to everything.
So your parents. So how do we go from, I believe, North India to Galveston, Texas?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
Yeah. Well, so my dad came here in the 60s on a World Health Organization visa. So this is a time where they said, hey, look, we wanted to bring to the U.S. very talented research scientists, people who are going to, promote discovery. And back then, my dad came from a tiny village. There was like nobody, in the village who was even practically literate. Imagine that, in their own native language. And somehow, out of all these kids, he had 7 brothers and sisters, lived basically in a village and a farm. He just was extremely bright. He was the youngest, and he was able to largely teach himself how to educate. He went to schools that were much further away, and always had good mentors. Right, so he had a great mentor who kind of pushed him in elementary school. Then he found another one in high school, and ultimately was able to get into research science and veterinary medicine there.
Wow.
In Punjab, in the north part of India. These folks around the world saw his talent and said, "Oh, okay, this guy looks really smart. He's clearly working on some difficult concepts." And so he befriended a guy from Czechoslovakia, and he actually came out to Punjab and stayed with him and worked with him for some time. So when he got this WHO visa, he had a chance to either go to the Czech Republic or he can come to the United States.
Okay.
And so I could have very easily been born in the Czech Republic, as it goes. But ultimately, he picked the U.S. And so, came here, got a bunch of postdoctorate degrees, went to Johns Hopkins and so on, and ultimately then had to go find research opportunities. And that one landed him at UT Galveston. And then that's where I was born.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there's a legacy that you need to uphold? The Randhawa name. Do you feel any pressure at all with all of your endeavors? Or
I don't know if it's a pressure. I think it's a belief, right? Like I said, to me, it's an obligation, right? This is something that we got to do. We have to try to make an impact. Why is it one guy out of a tiny village, out of a very large state of a very populated country, was able to make a huge impact? Well, there was something about his genetics and something about his fortitude, and he was able to make something happen.
Sure.
I think anyone who has the opportunity to do that, it's something that we have to do. So I don't look at it from that perspective. He's been gone now for a couple decades, but I'm sure he'd be very proud of the work. I mean, it's really that simple because, he always would tell me and my siblings as well, like, give it everything you got.
Right.
And, if you can, make that kind of major impact even better, because ultimately all we have is ourselves.
Yeah.
Humans. We got to go kind of promote that and make things better.
Absolutely. So he would be very proud. Yeah. So I'm looking at all of your endeavors here. So research scientist, and we talked about this before, founder of FAI, Food Allergy Institute, which we're about to talk about, founder of TPERT, Translational Pulmonary and Immunology Research Center, nonprofit, medical director, pediatric pulmonology, Miller's Children's, 5 different board certifications. I mean, the list goes on, Dr. Randhawa. So did you always aspire to be broad and not just focus on one aspect of medicine?
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, so when I was much younger, most of the work that I was in was like in microbiology, did definitely some immunology work early. I always found immunology the most amazing thing.
Really?
To me, that was like the final frontier. And, I think to this day that still holds true, right? Whether it's cancer or any other major diseases, if we can figure out how the immune system can model this, we can find a solution, and I really enjoyed that. So I'd say at my core, I've always had that area of focus. But to your point, as I kind of went through all my training and stuff, I was all over the place. I was going to be a surgeon. I have a surgical mindset. Surgeons, if you look at, doctors as a whole, they'll say surgeons are people who want to start and a finish. And I really like that. I don't want to necessarily have to manage something for extended periods of time, but we can resolve it. Why not?
Right.
Let's just get it fixed.
Right.
So, that was an area I was really focused in med school. But then after my father passed away, I kind of rethought about what do I want to do with my time? Because I kind of realized that, if his time is short, then my time can be short. And so how can I maximize what I'm able to do? So then I kind of went into general adult medicine, general pediatrics, looked at gastroenterology, looked at pulmonary, a bunch of different spaces. And ultimately, I've fixed on these 5 areas of board certification, but I'd still say to this day, I'm constantly overlapping into other areas of medicine.
Wow.
It doesn't, I'm not afraid of it. I will find a way to break it down into understandable segments. I will make sure that I understand completely what I'm dealing with, and I will dive into that space. And I think that makes me not only, a better physician, but it makes me a better scientist, and it gives me a lot of the ideas I have to kind of continue to disrupt systems.
And with that, sometimes you're not the most popular guy in the world because you're being disruptive.
That's right.
And we talked about that in the previous episode, the naysayers and the so-called haters. But do you still get a lot of that?
Yeah.
Do you still get a lot of that from colleagues? And
look, I'd say the vast majority of people, and I think this goes for any sector, any area of business. when you are the first to move things, you're the first mover, the second mover, et cetera, you're going to get a lot of pushback. People just are not comfortable with change.
Yeah.
And so, ultimately, even when you have significant change, look at the pandemic, right? You have huge amounts of change. People will immediately go hunker down into what they can do that is the same.
Mm.
And that's okay. I think that's the majority of people. But for those of us who are out there who are trying to actually push some evolution, right? Because to me, ultimately, this good disruption should promote evolution, right? There should be an evolutionary process that is getting better.
Good disruption should promote evolution. That should be on a T-shirt. Really?
Well, I'll work on that.
Okay,
That's a good one.
All right. Yeah.
Absolutely right. But ultimately, that whether it's music, sports, entertainment, all the way to science, engineering, technology. If you're doing good disruption, it's going to be adapted and it will continue to evolve. And we've seen that all throughout human history.
Yeah.
But I mean, that to me is what everyone should focus on. I think all too often when you think about disruption, it's somebody just trying to do something a little crazy or a little different. But no. Ultimately, it's going to be something that's going to change the whole system.
That sounds similar to good trouble. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but there's like a good trouble.
I like that.
Very similar.
I like that. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a way to look at it.
All right. I love that too. Food Allergy Institute.
Yep.
Founded in 2015. However, you were doing that work way before it was actually founded. Can you talk about the beginnings? I hear stories about you working in the basement of the hospital, developing this procedure. I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, I mean, so when I finally decided I was going to jump into the space, the very first thing I had to do is understand what is known, right? What is known, what is not known, and I was really honestly shocked that in 2005, look at any kind of metric you want. If I take an allergy board exam, how many questions are on food allergy? Almost none, which tells you that there's not a whole lot of interest in the space.
Right.
So then I look for journals and things of that nature. Very, very few publications, very few people in the space who are even trying to, put a dent in it. Then I was like, all right, well, if it's not there, then maybe I got to go look at the food world. So I got journals on nutrition and dietitians and all these kind of things. And then there it was like, oh yeah, peanut is just carbohydrate, protein, and fat. I was like, oh, that doesn't help me. That's not going to solve the problem. So then I just kept digging and digging. And then I went on to actual phylogenetics, which is a fancy term to say, how are plants related? And that's kind of where I got my first inclination of saying, all right, this is where the data is. This is where the information is. At least I can start here. So I started studying peanuts and all these different tree nuts and seeds and said, oh, there's some interesting information here. There's actually some similarities between all these different proteins. Can we better understand it? So that's the information I took back to my lab. We then started working and sequencing all these things. This is going back to 2006. And then I started partnering up with a couple small laboratories in the US. One was in Michigan. And we started studying how those things interacted with the immune system. So none of this was easy or fast, right? I spent about a year trying to understand where can I get more data. Once I saw that the patterns were there, I was like, all right, now we got to start studying this same sort of relationship in the human system. And that's when we started saying, all right, let's start gathering patients who have food allergies and studying their blood and understanding how their immune system responds.
All right, so this is so fascinating. We should probably save some of this for the next episode. So this is a precursor, what people can look forward to.
Absolutely.
Talking about FAI, but I wanted to at least touch on it. Yep. And so we're saving that for the next episode.
Fair enough. Fair enough. It goes deep.
It goes deep. Okay. Look forward to doing that. Thank you again. Appreciate all the insight, and Disruptive RX continues, and we look forward to the next episode.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean.